All right, so we're back with the second part of our conversation with Nate, Betsy, and Dr. Nick Holton. Dr. Nick is going to share one of his pet peeves around people mislabeling their own emotions, essentially. And I kind of resonated with this as I see a great deal of athletes and their parents that are very quick to label an emotion as stressful or even traumatic, when more accurately, the emotion could be disappointment, sadness, nervousness, anger, or fear. And here's the thing, when we don't label emotions accurately and everything is just anxiety, stress, or trauma when we're discussing what we're feeling or our mental health, well, then, and the science backs this up, then what can oftentimes happen is the conversation or our own mindset or how we're thinking about our feelings becomes problematic in and of itself. It becomes unhelpful. It's not good enough to just talk about mental health, depression, anxiety. We have to talk about them in a way that's beneficial. We have to talk about them with some accuracy in our language, or else we're kind of like misdiagnosing ourselves. It's kind of how I see it. So in today's episode, Dr. Nick, he's going to really get into some practical ways, though. It's not just a venting session by him or talking about one of his pet peeves. It's really him getting into practical ways that we can better talk about mental aspects of sports, mental health. And he's also going to really talk about how a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work for teams. You need to have a variety of options as everyone is in different places, and he's going to share some of those options. So let's get right into it. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name is JP Nervin. Our mission here is simple. We want to help coaches become better leaders and build better team cultures. Today's hosts of the interview are my good friends Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. If you're interested in learning more about our work as leadership coaches and facilitators, or if you want to explore our online courses and books, head on over to tocculture.com and betsybutterick.com. While you're at tocculture.com, don't forget to subscribe to the weekly newsletter. It's got the notes for each podcast episode, our latest articles, and practical culture building tips.
Nick, I want to ask you about uncertainty. And this is something that I hear a lot from athletes, especially at the college level, when there is uncertainty, whether it's in the college landscape of, are there going to be roster caps for my sport? Is my sport going to get cut? Or it's uncertainty in a game. Am I going to get to play this game? Or what's my role? When there's uncertainty, there often tends to be negativity and a felt sense of, well, if I go worst case scenario, I'm already priming and protecting myself from the worst that can happen. But then we know that doesn't often lend itself to high performance. What would you offer in space of when there's uncertainty? How do we make intentional choices to trend towards anti-fragility?
Great question. So let's deal with something you mentioned there first. Sometimes you should catastrophize. So let's break down the general process happening there. Okay. So athletes, coaches, thousands of years ago, and we are cave people. Okay. We wake up on a given day. We really have one core need. There's some core needs, plural, but there's really one: survival, right? Live to the next day. And so there's two types of behaviors really that we can use to accomplish that. One is an approach behavior. Okay? It's a go get something good. So that would sound like hunt and forage, right? Go get food. The other is an avoidance behavior. Stay in the cave because the saber-toothed tiger is out there, right? Avoid the bad. Over the course of, say, a week, months, whatever it might be, if you fail at the approach behavior, if you don't find food successfully, it's not really the end of the world because you can try again. But if you fail at the avoidance behavior, if you fail to avoid the saber-toothed tiger, probably ain't going to make it. And this is really, really important, Betsy, because the brain evolves to hold that in what's called a negativity bias. Negative stuff is stickier and more significant and more impactful to most human beings, right? And it's a survival mechanism. So for instance, right, if you're with one of your athletes, right, and they're thinking, I'm not sure all the ages that you work with, right, but they're on the recruiting path or process, whatever it might be, and you say to them, listen, I reached out to coach XYZ, and they know you're interested and you're going to try to get in touch with them, right? I pulled you this favor. That person probably should be catastrophizing about the worst case scenario if they don't reach out. For recruiting, that's the saber-toothed tiger, right? What we don't want, to your point, is catastrophizing that is mismatched. That is not realistic. That is highly, highly, highly improbable. And so we can get into that, but let's go through a couple layers here if we can, if you don't mind me ranting for a minute and just kind of like teaching here a little bit. So there's a central kind of tension here, right? Framing versus acceptance. Okay, so notice what we've done here already in terms of framing. Is an unpleasant feeling good, bad, or both? Does it depend? We've changed a frame. So you asked about uncertainty, right? And so take framing. Why is uncertainty bad? Like, could you imagine being an athlete and being certain of the outcome? Like, how boring?
Yeah,
How boring?
I mean, that would be a great question to start with an athlete, because what I hear often is, well, if it's uncertain, if I don't have the information I feel I need to either level set expectations or prepare appropriately for success, then that's risky. That doesn't feel good. And I know you just mentioned, you know, is
so go do those
good,
things.
bad, or other. Yeah.
Go do those things. Yeah, cool. That's how it should feel. Go do those things. Right? But, and I know we're going to get into identity, right? Be careful about getting your whole self wrapped up in these things in this process, right? And it's nuance there. But, you know, so here, like, this is how it would break down, right? So on the one hand, you can say, okay, how might I frame this scenario or help my athletes frame these scenarios and experiences in a way that helps maybe temper that negativity bias, temper some of that catastrophizing, keep things, we'd say just like chill out, right? Chill the F out and keep things in perspective is kind of, I think, what we're talking about here, right? And so we can nerd out on all these different steps, but if you take the framing perspective, which is a cognitive behavioral perspective, there's 3 sentences coaches should remember, okay? Or their athletes should remember. What's another way to look at that? What's another way to look at that, right? So common scenario, you know, the 3 of us are in a bank. There's 47 other people in the bank. Thief comes in, robs the bank, struggles with a security guard on the way out, gun goes off, I'm shot in the shoulder. Okay, Betsy, am I lucky or unlucky?
Depends. You weren't shot somewhere else, so you could say you're lucky, but you were shot, so you could say unlucky. So both.
Okay, so there's cognitive flexibility. Okay, so what happens in that moment is the brain generates a counterfactual. It's just like a hypothetical scenario to help us feel a certain way about it. Okay, if it's a hypothetical scenario, so, you know, first one is like, well, you know, you didn't get shot in the heart or head, nobody died, you're lucky relative to that, right? But if your first hypothetical is, well, could have walked into another bank another day, another time, you got a bullet in you, Nick, like that's pretty unlucky. Here's the cool part, we get to choose, right? So what's another way to look at that? And is it grounded in evidence? Is it real, right? And that's the key here, Betsy, because you could truly look at it either way. There was evidence for both realities. There is not always evidence for both realities. That's the other piece, right? So second sentence, that's not true because. So if those intrusive negative thoughts are the first ones coming in, argue with them, right? Go outside yourself to a degree, or think about your inner talk. We say, think about your thinking and push back, right? I'm going to fail because, right? We lost because of that ref. You know, I have no hope for the future. Coach is going to cut me from the team. Like all the things, whatever it is, that's not true because, and then present the contradictory evidence. By the way, if you can't find contradictory evidence, there's a couple more steps. Number 1 is ask somebody else. They might help find the blind spot, and coaches are great for that, by the way, right? Or guess what? You're right. Like worry. You're accurate, right? And so then that brings us to the third sentence and then acceptance. The third sentence is, what's the most likely outcome? How can I start planning for it? Best case scenario, okay, not that likely. Worst case scenario, okay, not that likely. What's most likely? How can I start preparing? And if they want to prepare for the worst case, that's fine too, right? However they really want to feel. But here's the key as we just move into acceptance instead of framing. Acceptance isn't trying to rethink and reframe and feel differently. Acceptance is just, I'm going to allow it in, I'm going to put it in my lap, and I'm going to figure out how to move forward with it in a values aligned way. regardless of how it feels. And that's more clutch. That's more Dame time.
And I think, and I know you talk a lot about this, that the values piece of this is also part of the choice, right, for the athlete. So if the most likely outcome is I'm probably not going to play in the big game. And so I got to come to terms with that before I'm on the bench. And then the next step is, so how do I want to show up as a teammate or for my team based on what is important to me, which I also have control over, right? So I don't have control over the coach's decisions necessarily, but I do have control over what is important to me and how I choose to show up for my team in that game. And I think that's coaching that very rarely happens because we don't want to engage in those hard conversations or, push through maybe what the athlete's feeling to help them, as you talked about before, the support in the water, getting them to that place.
Yeah. But man, what a good example of the utility of unpleasantness and the opportunity for a caring, supportive coach to step in, right? Because you said that, and I could think of like a quick half dozen opportunities where I screwed up as a player and as a coach. And you know how I knew I screwed up? I felt like shit, right? It was out of alignment with my values. Right. And I just bring it up because it's another good example. And so in those moments, sometimes I had people that maybe I needed to apologize to that were forgiving and then supportive and then helped, like my high school coach. There's been other moments where like I've screwed up and people were rightfully really mad at me and you just had to stew in that longer and process it. But it all teaches you about values, right? What you're describing there, and the psychological term is coherence or alignment. Like when we are not aligned, behaviors and values, we feel out of alignment, right? We feel incoherent. And so in the perfect world, you can stay tight to those values despite the affect, despite the emotion or the mood or the feeling. But that's a hard thing to do, obviously. Right?
It is, but I think that's part of the role of the coach, both collectively and individually, we have conversations, especially we're early in the year. Who do we want to be? Good, bad, or otherwise? We're trying to shape our collective identity. And in our one-on-ones, we're asking not just, what role do you want to be on the team and blah, blah, blah. We're asking them, what is your strength as a teammate? What do you do as a teammate that nobody else is doing?
Not just kids too, by the way. I think there's a lot of adults who don't necessarily reflect on their strengths or think about, like, how do I want to show up here regardless of how I feel or regardless of what is being asked of me, right? And take a little bit more ownership in that.
Well, Nick, I'd like to turn our attention a little bit here to, I think, another variable that kind of plays into this fragility conversation, especially in sport, when a player, a kid, and this happens to coaches too, but their identity, their sense of self gets wrapped up in performance. And there's lots of, great stories and famous stories. I think of Barry Zito as a guy that growing up had a hard charging father that everything was about make the major leagues, make the major leagues. He makes it with the A's, and then it's about Cy Young, Cy Young, Cy Young. He comes up short a couple of years, then he blows out his arm. And in his book, he just talks about, I have no idea who I am. He uses that phrase. And so it was like he shattered, right? When he couldn't uphold that performance that identified who he was as a person. So maybe speak a little bit to what's going on with the athlete, and then what do we do to provide some support for the athletes that we're working with?
Great question. So let's start with the premise or the framing again, right? So in the case of Zito, external, internal, whatever, it's ladder climbing, it's hoop jumping, right? And in the science, what we call this, or the potential problem with this, is what's called hedonic adaptation. It's psychologically being on a happiness treadmill. Okay, you're constantly spinning your wheels and you're never achieving satisfaction. Right, and listen, this is normal and natural. Anyone that ever graduated high school or got a degree or finished something they're proud of, you're sitting here listening. Tell me you feel the same way about it today you did the day of. We don't, right? We adapt, good and bad, right? But we adapt. This is why novelty feels good, and part of the reason why novelty feels good, because we're adapting to all this other stuff. Setting that up as the goal, right, long term, wildly problematic for motivation. It's all extrinsic. It's all wrapped up in identity. If we instead can create at least a predominant profile, it's not that you can't care about those things. It's not an either or, it's a both and, but a predominant profile that is intrinsically motivated and driven, right? That is really focused on love of the process, right? I'm thinking about the Tigers and the Kobe's and the Brady's and the LeBrons and the Iniescu's and whoever it might be, right? That are known for just putting in that work. Not necessarily because it's a grind, although it's largely unpleasant, but because they love the process itself. Now, why is all of that so important when it comes to performance? And this is going to sound a little maybe controversial or paradoxical, but like we don't really control our performance. I'll give you a simple example. You could take any sport, you could take video games, whatever it might be. If you are in a flow state, a state of peak performance where you are totally immersed, you are in the zone, are you thinking about what you're doing in that moment? No. You're no robot in that moment. It is automatic. You control your preparation. You control what you've done up until that moment to potentially visualize and prepare for that moment. But when the moment strikes, there's elements of luck and neurochemistry and physiology and things that are just totally outside of our control. And so coming full circle, and I know we're going to get into this more, but you better be real cautious about getting your identity wrapped up in outcomes because you do not control them. We do not control them. Which, by the way, going back, Betsy, thank goodness that's uncertain. Because again, how boring would it be?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the utility of unpleasantness before, and I think framing perspective shifts, so much of our opportunity, especially within sport, especially as coaches, is to help our athletes look at things differently. Because when you take a different perspective, you can have a different experience. And so everything, all the different layers that you're talking about, the questions that you're inviting coaches to ask, all of this allows us to become more skillful in starting to change the narrative for an individual because things are unpleasant, because things are uncertain. And that is an opportunity.
Yes. Yes. It's not like, yes, it might, first of all, not everything is stress. And this is a big pet peeve of mine growing, but certainly not everything is trauma, which gets overused a lot. And so I think even just from a starting point of like, what are you feeling about this? Is it pleasant or unpleasant? But then the next layer, and this is something that's worth mentioning, and it's a pretty easy thing for coaches to do. They may or may not be familiar with a Pareto principle. Pareto principle is like the 80-20 rule, right? So in a lot of different walks of life, 20% of the inputs create 80% of the outputs. Okay, and so here's a simple idea, right? There's about 100 different emotions on what's called the mood meter, which is this 4-quadrant color coordinated thing out of Yale, right? 100 of them. What are the 20 emotions that contribute to 80% of your athlete's experiences? And can you get better at identifying them and responding to them and helping them process them? Because I'll tell you something I have done, and this is consistent across collegiate athletes, professional athletes, executives, workshops. I do this all the time. I give people 60 seconds to write down as many emotions as they can think of. And rarely does a group have a group average that's in the double digits. Anyone that's ever learned an additional language, what do you do first? You start with vocab, right? And you can't describe everything as stress. You can't describe everything as trauma. That's not what it is. Sometimes it's nervousness. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes you're despondent. Sometimes you're pessimistic. Sometimes you're just annoyed. Those are all different and they require different responses. So coaches, great place to start is like pick your list of 20 and start getting better at those. But you could have your athletes start to do this as well. Because I mean this with affection and respect, but they're mostly emotionally dumb. They just don't have the language right now, or emotionally ignorant is a better term.
Yeah, because they'll describe their situation as, I don't know, this sucks. Like I just,
yes.
And what they mean is I'm not getting what I want. Right. And they don't necessarily have the ability to take it beyond that, whether that's disappointment or frustration or, there's a morning, whatever it is. our mission here at Thrive on Challenge is equipping coaches to be transformational. And these are the conversations that transform people, right? And maybe you could speak to this perspective, because we talk about this a lot in terms of, you know, the value and purpose of sport in society. To me, is it creates an environment to be able to learn and practice all these skills with a low level of consequence. They're not losing their job. Their marriage isn't falling apart. They're not, you know, alienating their children. Like it's not that big a deal, but it's the same skill that someday, eventually, they're going to have to be able to, you know, be able to employ in order to navigate the world. And so as coaches, sometimes we say, that's not my job. My job is baseline, out of bounds, and press break. But if we're transformational, like, these are the skills that we have to have in order to help transform young people.
And it's not an either or, it's a both and. I mean, you can look across the research. You want to find the things that are most predictive between like coaches or teachers and say pupils. It's the relationship. It's not the technical knowledge of the coach. It's not necessarily the communication style. It's like, can I figure out a way to connect to, relate to, and empower the different athletes that I'm working with? And then ideally, firefly sync them, right? Big potential.
Nick, as we're talking about emotions, and I love that you bring up this idea of emotional granularity and the sifting through the big emotions to get to the more granular, the more specific, so that we can take better action with better information, and how increasing our language, our emotional vocabulary, allows us to facilitate a greater level of emotional regulation or control. A question I often ask athletes is, do you act the way you feel, or do you feel the way you act? What's true in your experience, Nick?
Probably a both and, but tell me a little bit more about specifically what you mean by that question. I'd like to hear that.
Yeah, if we're talking about performance or looking through that competitive lens, if I feel nervous, and I understand what nerves are and how they are beneficial, how we're priming our body to perform well. And yet many athletes, when they feel nervous, the automatic association is, this is bad and I'm not going to perform well. And so based on how they're feeling, they make predictions or judgments about what happens next. So I act the way I feel. But then you've got another school of thought is, okay, well, if I act confident, I'll feel confident. You know, and I think of Amy Cuddy in Presence. And so is there an optimal avenue, knowing it's a both and? Both can be true. You can find success through either avenue. And contextually, it might be different from athlete to athlete or situation to situation. But when we talk about anti-fragility, is there a predominant pathway between acting the way I feel or feeling the way that I act? What happens first?
I think whether it's well-being, resilience, anti-fragility, performance, I think what you're talking about is states, right? So we move from one state or kind of makeup to a different state or makeup, right? So when we go from, you know, taking a break to running a wind sprint, right? We're changing states, right? Kind of simply put, right? So I mentioned earlier our framework: top down, bottom up, outside in. How do those ideas merge? Because states are not just mental or physical; they're always both. We're not a head detached from a body. We are just a nervous system, right, with a skeleton and some tissue and those sorts of things. And so there's plenty of research from different avenues, and the best person to look into for this, I think, is Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's sort of the expert out there on affect or feeling. And we should be specific about feeling. So there's really three types of what we call affect: mood, emotion, and feeling. Feeling would be like the physical sensation, if you will. Okay, mood is you don't really know it, but there's an undercurrent. And emotion is like, oh, I'm aware and I can label this sort of deal, right? So take for instance, like sometimes activation energy, so just starting the thing, leads to more motivation, right? Sometimes it's passion and interest and motivation that leads to doing the thing. When it comes to receiving a feeling or emotion, sometimes that's going to happen in the head first, right? Oh, I notice and label what I'm noticing nervousness. I've got these running negative panic thoughts. Sometimes I don't notice that I'm nervous. I just happen to notice that my hair is standing up on my forearm, right? Or palms start sweating. Okay. And so what I'm trying to say is like, these are all, and I mentioned it earlier, differentiation depends on the athlete. So let's take, we work with a variety of different like Division I programs. One of the programs just recently, their season just ended, NCAA tournament. Probably a third of their team had to work on that negativity bias and the inner narrative and some of the things coming with it. But some of them found success in visualization. Some of them found success in cognitive behavioral techniques. Some of them didn't do any of those, and they just took some of the breath work protocols we worked on. Some changed their minds, some changed their bodies, some did both. And there's one or two, by the way, because remember the third part of the framework is outside in. Some changed their relationships. So I'm thinking of one in particular, and this happens all the time, who like loves her father to death. Can't talk about the games together. It is not good for that player. And when she realized that and made the change, didn't change how she felt about her dad, but it did change how she played and how she felt. So again, it depends, but I think those buckets are helpful, right? Top down, thinking about your thinking. Can you do it in the head? Bottom up, is it breath work or some sort of relaxation routine? Or do you notice things somatically first? Do you need to tune into your body more? What we call interoception. It's awareness of the internal as opposed to exteroception, right? And then number three, outside in, is like, pay attention to who you surround yourselves with. It changes your habits, it changes your mood, it changes your feeling, it changes your mindsets, even about yourself. It can change your motivations. It's literally, all those things are truly contagious, truly.
All right, Nick, I've got two more for you, and then we'll wrap
Cool.
it up here. One of the most common questions that I get from a lot of the teams that we work with that are trying to build resiliency for the first time is that we're great in practice and we're good in games when things are going well. And then we get punched in the mouth and we fall apart and we can't get them back together. So if a coach comes to you, again, maybe not a lot of background in a lot of what we've been talking about here today, what is the first step? Where do you coach that coach? Obviously, they recognize the shortcomings, and that's an important piece. They can see maybe the moments where they become fragile and shatter. But just to get started with a team, what's the first couple steps?
So let's distinguish between, let's do two buckets. So let's say college and club versus, say, public school, okay, something like that. Why does that make a difference? Because the first thing I would say for college and club is be thoughtful about who you let on your boat. You only have so much control once they're there, right? I would say find what seems to be resilient families. Find the folks that seem to have emotional equilibrium. Find the folks that seem to seek and be excited about challenge, right? Like interesting mentioning framing. Anxiety and excitement or enthusiasm, they actually show up quite similarly in the body. The difference is the mental frame. And if you think about that physiologically, like it makes a lot of sense. They feel kind of this like high energy, right? So first and foremost, be thoughtful about kind of who you let on the boat. Let's say you don't control who you let on the boat, right? Depends on sort of what kind of capacity, right? I can give the ideal answer, but there's time restrictions on these things. But if we start with the ideal, I'd want some sort of assessment. I would not, all due respect to the coaches listening, but I wouldn't trust you to just guess and say, oh, that kid's resilient, that kid's not, and that kid's resilient on a scale of 3 to 5, and that kid's a 5. Well, let's hear some self-reports. Like, let's get a little survey. Let's have parents included in that and say, like, where do you think your kid could use a little adversarial growth? How can I be supportive with that, right? So like, there's the starting point. Then it becomes, how do I help each individual kid, maybe based on their style, maybe based on their needs or preferences, right? And every coach will know this. Some of the players I'm still closest with, I could yell and scream at. And they actually needed that, right, to get going. They requested it and right, wanted it. Others, not so much. So you got to know the kid, right? Then it becomes, okay, we could talk about a useful model here. If I'm going to take this individual kid that I'm building a relationship with, I have a sense of their baseline resilience. I want to help them build it. Ideally, I'm going to help them build it prior to these like really adverse scenarios in games, with exceptions of like your example, Nate, where you're putting them in there to do it, right? Well, then it becomes, what's the right, for lack of a better phrase, dosage for the kid? Just like we talked about with the scheduling, right? And so how might you consider dosage? And I want to be careful because this isn't that precise. This isn't medical advice, nothing like that. It's just an analogy, right? First and foremost, stress or stressors are experienced subjectively. Okay, so you've got a team, right? Let's go back to that example, Nate. Like they've got that 5A game coming up. That team is high press. The way player, your 1 through 4 experiences press is going to be totally different than your 5. Potentially, right? Or the kid that's spent their entire life doing AAU has got wild handles. Subjectively, not a big deal. Okay, so subjectivity is one of those. Now you got to think about, how's this individual going to receive it? Frequency. How frequent am I exposing the individual or the team to this stressor? Am I allowing recovery time? And so you could go to time, not just frequency, but time or lastingness as well. Right? Is it cyclical? Is there, you mentioned it, a follow-up, right? Meaning making, response to it. Okay? And then the other piece is intensity. And intensity is sort of like almost aside from a subjective assessment, like how intense of a stressor can I provide? Again, with basketball, like there's, you might say, well, okay, stress is subjective. Well, I'm pretty willing to bet that people like Bobby Knight was throwing chairs at weren't like subjectively saying whether that was bad or not, right? Like that was probably pretty objective, like, yeah, I'm not down with this sort of deal. Even then, there's some subjectivity, but the point is like you can cross lines with intensity that are going to be pretty widely understood as a line crossed. Be thoughtful about that. Know the boundaries, right? We're not trying to induce trauma. Right? It's manageable stretch goals around stressors and things that are unpleasant incrementally. And I mentioned earlier, if you don't mind me saying it real quick, but there's a lot of science in the kind of the neuroscience world around addiction that's relevant to this. You actually want, I've mentioned cycles, you want to teeter-totter the kind of pleasant, unpleasant dopaminergic system, right? And it's actually, and you mentioned parents, coaches that don't want to do these things with their kids, don't want to create the stretch goals. Guess what? You're doing more harm than good if you avoid that. Because somebody that constantly presses on the pleasant lever is the equivalent of somebody who consistently says, I'm going to have that drink, I'm going to use that substance, whatever it might be. And what happens, assuming you've got a lot of adults listening, but what happens when you constantly say yes to something? You build tolerance to it until you no longer feel really much of anything good from that thing. In other words, saying yes so much, pleasantness so much, is literally a pathway to addiction. You have to teeter-totter this, right? And so it is actually in their interest to make sure they're getting thoughtful, supportive, meaningful, unpleasant experiences to help teeter-totter that system.
Oh, I appreciate that insight there. I'm going to get you out of here on this. We've talked a lot about the athlete experience, and we've talked about the role of the coach in helping for them to, jump in the water and provide the right support so that they can grow. But I think coaches also have a responsibility for themselves when it comes to building their own resiliency, because we can also fall victim to all of the things that we've talked about, whether it's performance or it's uncertainty or what have you. So maybe parting shot of advice here for coaches and a bit of self-reflection. What is the best advice here for us in developing this anti-fragile approach here, just for me as a coach, before I'm even working with my players?
If you want to enhance your emotional awareness, if you want to enhance theirs, if you want to become less distractible, if you want to become higher performing and more focused, if you want to become a better listener, if you want to deepen relationships with your players, literally anything that you can do to experience personal growth or professional growth as a person or coach is dependent upon your ability to be in the moment. You have to catch thoughts, you have to catch feelings, you have to catch mindsets, you have to catch moods, you have to listen carefully, you have to pay attention to body language, you have to notice facial expression. And so what's the simple answer? And this is a kind of a fluffy word sometimes in coaching circles. It is mindfulness. It is having your mind completely filled up by the moment, not the past, not the future. And should you be mindful at all times? No. Sometimes you need to be thinking about the future, especially coaches. Like, what's coming down the pike? What do I have to prepare for, right? But there are moments where you need to be there and only there. And so this is a really simple action step for any coaches. There's so many apps that support this now. The Calm app, Headspace, Insight Timer, I think, is a free one. Waking Up with Sam Harris. Like, you can find all this stuff. It's all out there, right? Free subscription otherwise. 3 minutes a day. 3 minutes a day. It's so easy, and you'll just notice your ability to notice start to change over time. That's a great place to begin because everything else is built upon that.
Well, that's awesome. Nick, I really appreciate you taking some time with us here today, and insights have been fantastic, and hope someday maybe we can do a follow-up conversation as well, because this has been great and added great value for our coaches and our audience.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. They're awesome questions. Really enjoyed the chat and agreed. It was super flowy, group flowy, and yeah, thank you.
All right, that's it for our conversation with Dr. Nick. Check out his podcast, Flourish FM, and his website, nickknowlton.com. I was actually listening to one of his podcast episodes this morning. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, well, you need to be subscribed and reading our weekly newsletter. The newsletter shares a weekly article with practical tools and advice on building team culture and has discounts on our online courses. You can subscribe at tocculture.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast, the Coaching Culture Podcast. Be sure to check out my other podcast, the Culture Builders Podcast, which is about 2 to 3 minute episodes, 2 to 3 times a week. So if you're not sick of us, then check that one out. Also, be sure to share this episode if you found it valuable. Share it with some friends in coaching.